There's a new major global trade conflict that's been making headlines: the growing tensions between the United States and the European Union. With economic stakes higher than ever, this dispute isn't just about tariffs. It's about power, influence, and the future of international trade. For the past several years, trade between the US and the EU has been one of the most significant economic partnerships in the world. But in recent weeks, things have taken a sharp turn. The Trump administration has introduced aggressive tariffs on steel, aluminum, and a range of other imported goods, arguing that these measures are necessary to protect American industries and reduce the country's trade deficit. The European Union, on the other hand, sees these tariffs as unfair and damaging to international trade norms. This isn't the first time the US and the EU have clashed over trade policies, but the stakes feel different this time. The European Commission, the governing body responsible for trade policy in the EU, has made it clear that they will not sit back and accept these measures without a fight. In response, they have approved a massive retaliatory package worth $28 billion, targeting key American exports. This move sends a strong message to Washington that Europe will not back down in the face of economic pressure. To understand how things escalated to this point, we need to go back a bit and look at how trade relations between the US and the EU have evolved in recent years. When Donald Trump took office, one of his core promises was to put America first, particularly when it came to trade. His administration argued that many of the US's existing trade agreements put American workers at a disadvantage and allowed foreign countries to benefit at the expense of domestic industries. Under this philosophy, the US began imposing tariffs on steel and aluminum imports, setting rates at 25% and 10% respectively. These tariffs weren't just directed at the European Union, but also affected Canada, Mexico, and China. The justification? According to the Trump administration, these measures were necessary to protect the American steel and aluminum industries from foreign competition. However, many critics, including economic analysts and world leaders, saw this as a form of protectionism, an attempt to artificially boost domestic industries by limiting competition rather than allowing free market dynamics to play out. The European Union had been monitoring these moves closely, initially hoping that diplomacy would lead to a compromise. But as the Trump administration doubled down on its tariff policies, the EU's patience began to wear thin. European leaders, including European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen, repeatedly warned that these tariffs would not only harm the European economy, but would also backfire on American businesses by increasing prices and disrupting global supply chains. The impact of these tariffs isn't just a matter of political posturing. The transatlantic trade relationship is one of the most important economic partnerships in the world. Every year, goods and services worth nearly $1 trillion are exchanged between the US and the EU. From automobiles and agricultural products to high-tech equipment and consumer goods, industries on both sides of the Atlantic are deeply intertwined. Any major disruption to this trade flow has the potential to create ripple effects that impact millions of workers, businesses, and consumers. The American business community has also been vocal about their concerns. Major industry groups, including the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, have argued that tariffs ultimately hurt American consumers by driving up prices on imported goods. The steel and aluminum tariffs, for example, mean that American manufacturers who rely on these materials are now facing higher production costs. In turn, these costs are often passed on to consumers, leading to price hikes on everyday products. But from the Trump administration's perspective, these tariffs are a necessary tool to correct what they see as long-standing trade imbalances. One of the core arguments for these measures is that the U.S. has consistently run a trade deficit with the European Union. In other words, the U.S. imports more from Europe than it exports, and the administration sees this as a problem that needs to be fixed. By imposing tariffs, the goal is to make American-made goods more competitive and encourage consumers to buy domestic products instead of relying on imports. European leaders, however, argue that this approach ignores the complexities of modern global trade. Many American companies operate in Europe, just as European companies have a strong presence in the U.S. Trade isn't just about exports and imports. It's about investment, shared supply chains, and collaborative industries. Disrupting this balance, they say, could have unintended consequences that hurt both economies in the long run. Despite these warnings, the Trump administration has remained firm in its stance. President Trump has repeatedly emphasized that his administration is willing to take bold action to protect American interests, even if it means clashing with traditional allies. Speaking at a recent economic summit, he reiterated his commitment to reducing the trade deficit and ensuring that American industries are not being taken advantage of by foreign competitors. On the other side of the Atlantic, European leaders are now preparing to escalate their response. The approval of the $28 billion retaliatory package is a clear signal that the EU is ready to match Washington's tariffs with countermeasures countermeasures of its own. This means that American products ranging from motorcycles and agricultural goods to luxury items and technology could soon face heavy tariffs when entering European markets. One of the key arguments from the European side is that these tariffs are not just about protecting their own industries, but also about standing up for international trade rules. The EU has long been a supporter of free trade and multilateral agreements, and they argue that unilateral tariffs like the ones imposed by the US undermine the entire global trading system. By responding with their own tariffs, they hope to send a message that economic pressure tactics won't go unchallenged. So where does this leave us? At this point, both sides are preparing for what could become a full-scale trade battle. While negotiations are still on the table, the reality is that neither side appears willing to back down. The US sees tariffs as a necessary tool for reshaping global trade in its favor, while the EU views them as a violation of long-standing agreements and economic fairness. As tensions continue to rise, the big question is whether this dispute will escalate further or whether last-minute negotiations will lead to a compromise. History has shown that trade conflicts often start with aggressive moves and strong rhetoric, but they can sometimes be resolved through diplomatic channels before the economic damage becomes too severe. Whether that happens here remains to be seen. In what is now shaping up to be one of the most significant trade conflicts between the two economic giants, the EU has approved a $28 billion retaliatory package aimed at countering the aggressive tariffs imposed by the Trump administration. This move is designed to protect European businesses and ensure that the EU is not seen as an easy target in this trade dispute. But what does this countermeasure entail, and how will it impact industries on both sides of the Atlantic? The European Commission, the body responsible for handling trade policies in the EU, spent months carefully analyzing the US tariff measures and preparing a response. While European officials initially hoped that diplomacy would prevent an all-out trade war, it became evident that a stronger approach was needed. The approval of this massive retaliatory package marks a significant escalation and highlights the EU's determination to stand its ground. At the heart of this response is a well-calculated list of tariffs aimed at American goods. The EU is not simply placing broad tariffs across the board. Instead, it has strategically selected products that will have both economic and political impact. The goal is to hit key industries that are important to the U.S. economy, while also ensuring that European businesses are shielded from unnecessary damage. One of the most talked about sectors targeted by these tariffs is the American motorcycle industry, specifically brands like Harley-Davidson. For years, Harley-Davidson motorcycles have been a popular import in Europe, with thousands of units sold annually. However, under the new EU tariff package, these motorcycles will be significantly more expensive for European consumers, which could lead to a drop in sales and financial losses for the company. This move is especially significant given that Harley-Davidson has already faced challenges in recent years due to changing consumer preferences and rising production costs. Another major industry affected by the EU's countermeasures is American agriculture. European officials have placed tariffs on a wide range of agricultural products, including soybeans, peanut butter, and citrus fruits. This is a calculated decision because American farmers are heavily reliant on exports, and losing access to the European market could result in excess supply and lower domestic prices. American farmers have already been struggling with uncertainty in trade due to tensions with China, and this new development adds another layer of risk for the agricultural sector. The alcoholic beverage industry is also in the crosshairs. The EU is imposing tariffs on American whiskey and bourbon, a move that directly impacts major producers in states like Kentucky and Tennessee. European consumers have long been significant buyers of these products, and these tariffs could lead to a decline in demand. This is not just an economic issue, but also a political one, as many of these industries are based in regions that strongly supported President Trump. By targeting industries in politically important states, the EU's response could increase pressure on the Trump administration from within the U.S. Luxury goods and technology products are also on the list. The EU has signaled that high-end American-made items, such as certain fashion brands and premium electronics, will be subjected to higher tariffs. This move serves two purposes. First, it ensures that high-value goods from the U.S. face the same challenges as European goods in American markets. And second, it sends a strong message that the EU will not allow Washington to dictate trade terms unilaterally. The approval of this package has not come without internal debate. While the European Commission has emphasized the importance of unity, some countries within the EU have voiced concerns about the potential fallout. Germany, for example, has strong trade ties with the U.S., particularly in the automotive industry. German automakers such as BMW, Volkswagen, and Mercedes-Benz sell a significant number of vehicles in the American market, and any prolonged trade dispute could hurt their sales. France has also been particularly vocal in this debate. The French wine industry is one of the largest exporters of wine to the U.S., and there are concerns that an escalation in the trade conflict could result in retaliatory tariffs on European wine. Given that the U.S. is a major consumer of French and Italian wines, any disruption in this trade could lead to financial losses for European wine producers. Despite these concerns, European officials believe that standing firm is the right approach. The EU's strategy is built on the idea that it must show strength in the face of economic pressure. If it were to back down without a firm response, it could set a precedent that allows the U.S. to impose unilateral tariffs without fear of consequences. By approving this $28 billion package, the EU is signaling that it is prepared to engage in a long-term trade battle if necessary. The impact of these tariffs extends beyond just the industries involved. Consumers on both sides of the Atlantic could also feel the effects. If the EU tariffs lead to a drop in American exports, manufacturers and producers in the US may raise domestic prices to compensate for lost sales. At the same time, European consumers will likely face higher prices on American goods, which could shift buying habits and impact overall trade flows. The question now is whether this move will bring the US and EU back to the negotiating table or push the situation into a full-scale trade war. Historically, trade disputes often begin with tit-for-tat tariff measures, but eventually lead to discussions aimed at finding a compromise. However, given the current political climate and the strong rhetoric coming from Washington, there is no guarantee that negotiations will happen anytime soon. From the U.S. side, the Trump administration has responded with defiance. White House officials have downplayed the impact of the EU's tariffs, arguing that the U.S. economy is strong enough to withstand any retaliatory measures. President Trump has suggested that if the EU proceeds with its countermeasures, the U.S. could impose even higher tariffs on European goods, including automobiles and luxury products. This threat has caused some concern among European automakers, who fear that their access to the U.S. market could be severely restricted if tensions continue to escalate. Despite the tough talk from both sides, there is still room for negotiation. Economic experts have pointed out that while these tariffs make strong political statements, both the U.S. and the EU have a vested interest in maintaining stable trade relations. The reality is that neither side can afford a prolonged trade war, especially at a time when global economic growth is already facing challenges. In the coming weeks, attention will be focused on whether any diplomatic efforts can de-escalate the situation. If no resolution is reached, we could see further rounds of tariffs and countermeasures, leading to increased economic uncertainty. What's clear for now is that the EU has made its position known. It will not simply accept U.S. tariffs without a response, and it is willing to take strong action to defend its economic interests. This move is not just about trade. It's about setting a precedent for how the EU will handle economic pressure in the future. The question is, how will the Trump administration respond? Will this trigger a further escalation in the trade dispute, or is there still a path to negotiation? As tensions rise, the American business community, lawmakers, and even some members of the Trump administration are debating what happens next. The reaction so far has been mixed, with some supporting the tough stance on trade and others warning that the retaliatory tariffs could have serious consequences for the U.S. economy. From the beginning, President Trump has remained firm in his belief that tariffs are the best way to protect American industries and reduce the country's trade deficit. His administration has argued that, for too long, the U.S. has been at a disadvantage in global trade agreements, allowing other countries to benefit at the expense of American workers. The America First trade policy is built around the idea that by imposing tariffs on foreign goods, the U.S. can encourage domestic production and force trading partners to renegotiate deals on more favorable terms. This strategy has been met with strong opposition from the European Union, which argues that these tariffs violate international trade rules and are harmful to both sides. The approval of the EU's retaliatory package is the latest sign that Europe is not willing to accept these measures without consequences. The Trump administration, however, has responded by downplaying the impact of these countermeasures. White House officials have insisted that the U.S. economy is strong enough to handle any retaliation from the EU and have suggested that if Europe proceeds with its tariffs, Washington could respond with even more aggressive trade measures. One of the key figures in this trade dispute is U.S. Secretary of Commerce Wilbur Ross, who has defended the administration's decision to impose tariffs, stating that the U.S. is simply protecting its interests. According to Ross, the EU's countermeasures will have only a minimal effect on the American economy, and the administration is prepared to take further action if necessary. However, within Washington, not everyone shares this level of confidence. Among U.S. lawmakers, reactions have been divided. Some members of Congress, particularly those aligned with Trump's economic policies, have supported the tariffs, arguing that they are necessary to protect American industries from unfair competition. Others, however, have raised concerns that the escalating trade war with the EU could end up doing more harm than good. Lawmakers from states with strong manufacturing and agricultural industries have been particularly vocal, warning that retaliatory tariffs could lead to job losses and declining exports. The business community has also been watching these developments closely, and many industry leaders have expressed concerns that the ongoing trade dispute could have long-term consequences for American companies. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce, which represents businesses across various sectors, has warned that tariffs on both sides could disrupt supply chains, increase costs for manufacturers, and lead to higher prices for consumers. One of the biggest concerns is the impact of these tariffs on American farmers. The European Union is one of the largest markets for U.S. agricultural exports, and the retaliatory tariffs will make it more expensive for European buyers to purchase American products. This could lead to a decline in sales for American farmers, many of whom are already facing challenges due to trade tensions with China. Some agricultural groups have called on the Trump administration to reconsider its approach, arguing that tariffs are making it harder for them to compete in international markets. The automotive industry is another sector that could be hit hard by the trade dispute. European automakers such as BMW and Mercedes-Benz have a significant presence in the U.S., operating manufacturing plants that employ thousands of American workers. If the trade conflict continues to escalate, there is a risk that these companies could reduce their investment in the U.S., leading to potential job losses. At the same time, American automakers that export vehicles to Europe could see a decline in sales if tariffs make their products more expensive for European consumers. For many businesses, the biggest concern is uncertainty. Trade disputes create instability in global markets, making it difficult for companies to plan for the future. Some businesses have already started adjusting their supply chains in anticipation of further tariffs, shifting production to different countries to avoid potential disruptions. This kind of uncertainty can have a ripple effect on the economy, affecting everything from stock prices to consumer confidence. Despite these concerns, the Trump administration appears determined to continue its hardline approach. President Trump has repeatedly stated that the U.S. will not be intimidated by retaliatory measures and has suggested that if the EU does not back down, the U.S. could impose even more tariffs. One of the threats currently on the table is a potential tariff on European automobiles, which could have major implications for the auto industry on both sides. There is also a political dimension to this trade dispute. With the U.S. heading into an election cycle, trade policy has become a key issue for voters. Trump's supporters see the tariffs as a necessary step to rebuild American manufacturing and reduce the trade deficit, while his critics argue that they are hurting consumers and damaging relations with key allies. The outcome of this dispute could have an impact on the political landscape, influencing voter sentiment and shaping the debate over economic policy. On the European side, officials have made it clear that they are not looking for a full-scale trade war, but they are also not willing to accept tariffs without a response. European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen has emphasized that the EU prefers dialogue over confrontation, but has warned that Europe will not hesitate to defend its economic interests. European leaders have also been reaching out to other global partners, including Canada and China, to discuss coordinated responses to U.S. trade policies. The broader question now is whether this trade dispute will lead to further escalation or whether negotiations will begin to de-escalate tensions. Historically, trade conflicts often start with strong rhetoric and aggressive measures, but eventually lead to talks aimed at finding a resolution. However, given the current political climate, it is unclear whether either side is willing to make the first move toward compromise. Some economic analysts believe that the most likely outcome is a negotiated settlement, where both sides agree to roll back some of the tariffs in exchange for new trade agreements. Others warn that if neither side backs down, the trade war could continue to escalate, leading to more tariffs, higher costs for businesses, and potential economic disruptions. In the coming weeks, attention will be focused on how Washington responds to the EU's retaliatory measures. If the U.S. decides to impose further tariffs, it could push the conflict into new territory, making it even harder to find a resolution. On the other hand, if there are signs of diplomatic efforts behind the scenes, there may still be a chance for negotiations to bring both sides back to the table. For now, the situation remains uncertain, and businesses, consumers, and policymakers will be watching closely to see what happens next. Will Washington take an even tougher stance, or will there be room for compromise? As this trade dispute continues to unfold, the economic and political implications could shape global trade policies for years to come. That's it for today's update, but this is far from over.